The US and Brazil are the two largest exporters of soybeans. China is the world's largest importer of soybeans. China was buying all their soybeans from the United States just as a way to kind of make it up a little bit. Like, well, we got to buy the soybeans anyway. Why not buy them from the US to keep the US-China trade deficit under control so it doesn't become too politically toxic? Well, as soon as Trump threw on the tariffs, China retaliated by moving their soybean orders to Brazil, stop buying U.S. soybeans. Well, that's not a phone call. I mean, you're talking about vessels, port facilities, agriculture, trucks. How do you get the soybeans to the ports? How many do you grow? Where's the fertilizer coming from? Et cetera, et cetera. And all those parties, the shippers, the cargo, the insurance companies, there's so many people involved, banks, letters of credit, it's just a lot involved. They don't like short-term relationships. They say, okay, I'll do it. I want a 5-year contract. And China said, okay. So they reconfigured all those transportation lanes to get the soybeans from Brazil. All of a sudden, you're a U.S. soybean grower. You say, well, what do? Well, we started selling them to the Netherlands because the Netherlands needs soybeans too. So now instead of shipping them from like Port of LA to Ningbo and near Shanghai, we're shipping them from Port of Houston to, I don't know, France, Marseille or someplace, or Rotterdam. So the point being, you completely scrambled all these supply chain relationships. I talked to the guy who, this is a worldwide endeavor, but he was probably the single most responsible individual for all the significant developments in the supply chain in the last 30 years. And he said to me, Jim, you have to understand, it took us 30 years to build it. We blew it up in 3 years. It's not going to come back overnight. It's going to take 10 years or more to rebuild it. And what I talk about in the book is supply chain 1.0, which is 1989 to 2019, and then supply chain 2.0, which kind of starts now, but is going to go indefinitely because it's going to take a long time to put this together.
Jim Rickards highlights a fundamental shift happening in the global supply chain, emphasizing that while a new system will eventually emerge, it will look very different from the one we've known for the past 30 years. That era was all about efficiency, cutting costs at every possible point, similar to the Walmart model. The focus was on minimizing expenses with practices like just-in-time inventory and cross-docking, where goods go directly from one truck to another without ever sitting in a warehouse. This approach lowered costs but came with hidden risks. For example, companies consolidated suppliers and transportation lanes to reduce costs even further. If they could manage with fewer suppliers or ports, they could negotiate better rates and streamline their operations. Walmart, Amazon, and others mastered this system, but in doing so, they made the entire network more vulnerable to disruptions. When you depend on just a few suppliers, a single strike or delay can cripple the entire supply chain. With only a handful of ports or transportation options, any bottleneck can cause serious delays. Now, that fragility is showing. There's a shortage of truck drivers, around 80,000 are needed, just as there are bottlenecks and delays across ports. While the system can be rebuilt, the upcoming supply chain 2.0 will be fundamentally different. Terms like friendshoring, mentioned by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, or a constellation of nations, as Macron describes it, point to a more localized, diversified supply chain strategy. The shift is toward building resilience, even if it means higher costs, marking a major pivot away from the cost-cutting mindset that has dominated for decades. Jim Rickards explains that we're moving toward a new global club of trading partners, where countries will still trade, outsource, and have transportation lanes, but only among members. This club will likely consist of democratic, liberal republics such as Western Europe, the EU, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and possibly India. China, however, will be excluded due to a mutual decoupling. Both the US and China are moving away from each other's economic networks. While the US is involved in this process, it's something China wants as well. China is expected to develop its own network, perhaps involving Central Asian republics and parts of Southeast Asia, but it will lose a significant customer base, particularly in the United States. The US won't buy Chinese goods, especially high-tech items, and likewise, China won't have access to the US market. This restructuring will fragment the world into separate economic clubs. Trade and transportation lanes will still exist, but they'll be more restricted, with slightly higher prices in exchange for greater security. Rickards likens this to buying insurance. You hope you never need it, but if something happens, it's worth it. The difference between old and new prices will serve as an insurance premium for a more reliable and secure system, which has a major national security component. In his book, Rickards discusses how these changes impact the supply chain, dedicating chapters to its breakdown, the causes, and future constraints. His editor encouraged him to include a chapter on inflation, which is largely driven by supply chain disruptions. Rickards also adds a chapter on deflation, even though it seems unexpected with current inflation being persistent, not transitory. He believes deflation is on the horizon, even though inflation is clearly present today, driven largely by cost-push factors on the supply side. Jim Rickards explains that we're currently experiencing cost-push inflation, driven largely by supply-side issues like energy price shocks, shortages of fertilizer, strategic metals, and components due to the Ukraine conflict. This is impacting manufacturers in places like Germany, where factories are even shutting down due to lack of supplies. In contrast, demand-pull inflation, when consumers drive demand by purchasing items in anticipation of price increases, was a major factor in the 1970s. Back then, inflation started with supply constraints from the Arab oil embargo but was later fueled by demand-pull pressures. Rickards recalls that employers were raising wages almost automatically to keep up with the inflation rate, which was spiraling out of control until Fed Chairman Paul Volcker took drastic measures to stop it. Today, however, we're not seeing demand-pull inflation. Instead, we have cost-push inflation, a crucial distinction. Cost-push inflation is often self-limiting. As prices rise too high, demand eventually decreases because people cut back. For instance, high oil prices will eventually lead people to drive less or cut down on activities that require energy. When unemployment rises, people simply buy less, which can tip the economy into a recession and bring prices down. Rickards cites the 1974 experience under President Ford, when efforts to curb inflation led to a recession and a temporary price collapse. He believes that this pattern will likely repeat. Cost-push inflation will fade as the economy enters a recession, leading to disinflation or even deflation. Unfortunately, Rickards warns, the Fed may continue to raise interest rates even as the economy slows, exacerbating the downturn and pushing prices even lower. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, consider joining our community by subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Thank you for being a part of our community.